Okay, and so here we go. I sat next to this lady at a meeting with Alan Berger and Herb Kagan, and she took notes constantly. And so when I saw her taking notes, I made sure I took notes too. So I want you to welcome Dr. Samantha Duggan tonight to talk with us about raising the next generation, or emotionally sober parenting and grandparenting. Oh my gosh, do I need that badly? And so I want to welcome Samantha. Really so good to see you again. And I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say. So sit back, take out your notebooks and take notes for sure. And here we go. Samantha, come on in.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you very much. Yes, it was, thank you for telling the whole group about my compulsive note-taking habits. It's, I enjoy taking notes. I like that. I like learning. So let me start with an introduction. I know some of you have already heard me speak, but some of you, I'm sure, haven't. So my name is Samantha, and I am a behavioural psychologist, and I am a person in long-term recovery. I've done that with the help of the 12-step fellowships, multiple of them. And my talk tonight is very different from my two previous. So I came to psychology before I came to recovery. I know a lot of people find their way into it the other way around, recovery first, then psychology, therapy, counseling afterwards. That's not my story. I came to psychology first, and I was already a psychologist when I got into recovery. And this talk today is really about my private practice work. So I've done a talk on my kind of hobby, which is theology surrender. That's what I got into after I got into recovery. I've given a talk on my work with the All-Party Parliamentary Group. That's advocacy for 12-step recovery. And this is my baby, really. This is the work I've mostly been doing for the last, well, a long time, 15, no more years, that I moved sideways out of academic clinical psychology research and into this. This is what I do now. I work with parents on helping them to create functional family systems. This is my work that I call the fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance at the bottom. So I'm going to be talking tonight about principles that foster healthy relationship, healthy communication, honest and open communication. And all of that is always oriented towards trying to minimize childhood trauma. I'm equally excited and nervous about this talk tonight, and I've been trying to trick my nervous system. Excitement and fear feel really similar in the nervous system, and I think that's probably why excitement made its way onto the list of, feelings that we need to watch out for in the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book. Because, when excitement comes up, we can get a little bit derailed with some of our less optimal behavior, shall I call it. So I'm a little bit nervous about this one, and let me explain why. Working in this area as long as I have been now, I realize that parenting is probably, arguably the topic on which we are as sensitive as any other topic. When clients come to see me, I know automatically that they really are motivated to be good parents. And I have found that with my clients across the board. You don't come to speak to somebody like me unless you're motivated to be a really good parent or grandparent or foster parent or step parent or co-parent or whatever the situation is. So I know that inside the hearts of the parents who come and speak to me and who come on talks like this is a really strong desire to do a good job. And unfortunately, the flip side to that can mean that we're highly sensitive to when it starts to become clear to us that maybe there's some way in which we could improve. And so I want to lay that out there at the start and say that my intention is to help anybody pick up a tip or a suggestion or an idea, to help them have an aha moment, to give them something that they might like to try out in their family that would help them take another step along the progress journey. So that's my intention. I'm aware that people might get triggered along the way. Try not to worry about it too much, or take a few deep breaths or whatever, because it is sensitive. And I've been on this journey myself, so I know all about my own sensitivities as a parent and how painful it can be when we realize that maybe we've done something wrong that has hurt our children in the moment or even harmed them. So that's what we're going to be talking about. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. And in a sense, this is my journey. This is my journey. The first slide. So this is really me telling the story, to begin with anyway, of how I moved from what I would call a fully paid up attachment theory proponent to reclaiming some of the behaviorist ideas that I had learned and been trained in, as well as part of my training in psychology. So let's talk about these two schools of parenting approach. I know attachment theory is probably well known to many of the people listening today. It goes back quite a way. So let's say John Bowlby was one of the earliest proponents of this, Mary Ainsworth as well. They wrote the attachment theory idea and observed the 4 different attachment styles that children and parents can have. Secure attachment, maybe 2/3, anywhere from half to 2/3 of people apparently have secure attachment. And then we have the other 3 types of insecure attachment. So we have avoidant, anxious, and disorganized or fearful attachment. And depending on the studies you look at, the percentages of people that fall into those categories vary according to the studies, but a significant minority of people have what's called insecure attachment. We are wired for connection and attachment. Bowlby thought of this idea that the entire behavioral system is oriented towards getting attached to a primary caregiver. Konrad Lorenz was an ethologist. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the little goslings following the man. It's a really sweet study they're sweet pictures. I don't know if you'd think it was a sweet study, because Konrad Lorenz took half a group of goslings that had been born and discovered through replacing himself with their primary attachment figure that they imprinted on him. So through that, we understood that it was a biological drive in the infants to attach to a primary caregiver. Anyway, so that was in around about the 60s. And in fact, Bowlby had been a doctor and psychiatrist trained in the psychoanalytic tradition, and he wanted to bring a little bit more of the behavioral focus out there in the world into what had been a very inner focus. Psychoanalytic tradition focuses very much on the inner world. Contrast all of this with behaviorism. So John Watson would be a key figure in behaviorism. This is the early part of the 20th century. 1913, he published his key paper. And Watson, following Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, then also took up this mantle. They wanted to make the emerging science of psychology much more scientific. And they wanted to get people to focus on behavior that could be observed. And they were a little bit mistrustful of inner processes that couldn't be measured. It was too subjective. Psychologists were not going to be respected the way other scientists were if they continued to talk about things that you couldn't see and you couldn't measure. And so they encouraged a focus on behavior out there in the world. And, you know, their contributions, the contributions of both these schools have been massive. And I think a major takeaway that I would like people to come away with today is that either of these approaches over focus on either of these approaches leads to a suboptimal outcome. You really need the principles of both of these things, because both of these really describe important aspects of the reality of human development and the parent-child relationship, and of course, the reality of how the world works and what happens to us when we behave in the world. So, like I said, I have two children, maybe tell you a little bit about that. My son is 20, my daughter is about to turn 18 later this week. My husband delivered both of our children. My son was born at home. I didn't take any medication with either of them. I breastfed Flynn, stayed at home, sought out when I returned to work, the highest quality of daycare that I could find for him. I was really on this attachment thing. We co-slept. I wanted to do, infant-led weaning, all of these things. Like, I was a fully paid up member of the attachment brigade, shall I put it that way. And I found, then my daughter was born when he was just over 2 years of age. I found that my head full of theory wasn't corresponding to the reality of how my children were actually behaving in the world. And I was trying to shun certain aspects of behaviorism, specifically what I would call positive and negative punishment. And I'll speak more about that later in the world. And with only attachment to go on, I had no way to discipline my children's bad behavior, poor behavior, if you prefer. So this was the early years of my journey. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not working out the way I thought it would. And so I went on a parenting course, and that was a real moment for humble pie eating. I had to go and do a parenting course to help me raising my own children. I'm also in early recovery and trying to proceed my own journey in that regard as well, while I'm looking after these two small children and trying to work around that as well. So I signed up to first do a parenting course, and then I trained in this, and this is what cast me off on this other completely different direction, where I started to work exclusively with parents. And I encountered the work of Dr. Stephen J. Bavelec. So he was an American. We're moving into the 1970s now. So attachment theory is the 60s. We have behaviorism, the early 20th century. Now into the 70s, Stephen J. Bavelec was a pioneer in working with children who have experienced abuse and neglect. And his work was all oriented towards trying to prevent child abuse. And also he was a pioneer in parent education. And he observed that with teens who ended up in juvenile detention, he was able to identify 4 sort of unhelpful parenting attitudes that were commonly present in the parenting styles of the parents of the children who had ended up in trouble. And we worked backwards from those things. So he turned the sort of negative approaches on their head and reversed these destructive approaches, and came up with what he called his 4 constructs for a more positive approach and a more successful approach to parenting. And this has been pivotal in my work. I think this is excellent still to this day. I think it's excellent work. So self-awareness, appropriate expectations, empathy, and positive discipline are the building blocks of what I like to call good enough parenting. The goal with all parenting is good enough. Children can be very understanding. The human being doesn't need perfect parents. It just needs good enough parents to lead to reasonable outcomes. So this is the bedrock of emotional health, these 4 constructs. And I thought I might spend a little bit of time speaking about them. So self-awareness, a lot of us are people in recovery. We need to start to know ourselves a little bit better. So things like halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, start to become aware of when these things are going on in you and take responsibility for meeting your own needs around these things. Appropriate expectations. Now, this is about having the right level for the child, and depending on their age and developmental stage, but also the individual child. And one of the things I like to use to illustrate this is that we're very good at understanding that children have different windows for when they walk. So in general, children will walk between 9 months and 23 months, with the average being around 13 and 14 months. So if you have a child that walks at 9 months, that's very early. 23 months is late. You often see that in boy twins. They will walk later than the average. But within that window, most parents don't tend to worry. However, when it comes to other things, parents tend to worry an awful lot, and they set they wonder and worry about where to set the bar, and without sometimes realizing that there can be wide variability in when other behaviors come online. So, for instance, one of the things that I see with clients over and over, and experience this myself, when is it reasonable to expect a child to sit at the dinner table? Well, that depends on the temperament of the child, but there is also a window where you could sort of expect that to happen. And I always encourage parents not to worry if we're within a reasonable window. Empathy. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about empathy, but I'm aware that people now can use these words in different ways, but what I mean by empathy is helping the other person to feel understood. Yeah, so it's okay to guess and get it wrong. Children, I find, will correct you if you say, it looks like you're feeling a bit cross, and they'll go, no, I'm upset. And so I always say, don't worry about making a guess at what's going on for a child. They will probably correct you. So sometimes empathy has words, sometimes it doesn't have words. Silent empathy, I'm very fond of silent empathy, just listening and maybe nodding and saying, yeah, these are all wonderful things to do as well. But that helping a person to know that you get them, you've stood in their shoes, and you get what's going on for them. Positive discipline. This is one of the things that I think parents find the hardest. When I say positive discipline, what I mean is that you respond positively to positive behavior, and you respond, yeah, not react, fairly and reasonably to negative behavior or poor behavior. Yeah, so that's what I mean by positive discipline. And I'm going to speak in a little while about the components of learning that are part and parcel of positive discipline. So the role of empathy. An awful lot of parents, I find, when they come to me, they've been doing an awful lot of education of their children, and that is right and good and proper. It is our job as parents to pass on our values, to pass on how the world works, and that means that we're going to be doing an awful lot of explaining and educating. And yet, if we overemphasize that and we don't pause and stop and use a little bit of empathy before we come in with our explanations and our education, then the child ends up not feeling understood at all, not seen, not heard. And this can lead to less than ideal outcomes. So I always say it's a good idea to do a bit of empathy before you come in with the education. Yeah. But, and this I think I would attribute to the vogue for attachment parenting that's in at the minute. I think a lot of parents now understand that empathy is a good idea. And so they do empathy, but then they forget about the boundary, right? So empathy on its own is not enough. You need empathy and boundaries. And in fact, there are times when empathy should be avoided. It's, not the time and the place. And the reason why empathy should be avoided in certain situations is, and I'm going to get this here. So what we pay attention to is what we get more of. Yeah. And I think we've, maybe you've seen it, I see it a lot, but this is my world. So maybe other people haven't seen or heard this idea. So this is where a parent comes in, gets down to the level of the child, and gives them loads of lovely empathy and understanding. Oh, I see that you hit your friend with your truck on the leg. I wonder, how are you feeling? Why did you hit them on the leg? Are you upset about something? You know, so they're doing their best to try and give empathy, because they understand that behavior has a reason. All behavior has a reason. And they're falling into the empathy trap. Yeah, they're falling into the trap of giving loads of attention. Yeah, the empathy trap. They're giving loads of attention to behavior, which means that it will probably increase. So if you pay too much attention to bad behavior, I'm afraid that's like pouring baby bio onto the bad behavior. You're going to get more of it. So you need to be really careful when a child has behaved, has manifested behavior that you'd like to see gone, right? We all want to see that children learn, when frustrated, not to lash out and hit, which is very common in the early years. You want to see them be able to respond by not hitting, maybe hitting a pillow instead, eventually writing a note, eventually speaking in a reasonable fashion to tell you how cross they are. But these are stages that they have to go through. So watch out for that, putting too much lovely empathy, attention, without enforcing a boundary. So I remember in one of the 10-week parenting courses I was delivering, we always begin with empathy in week 1, explain how it works, and then send parents away to have a go at bringing empathy into a situation where they wouldn't normally think to do so. And we had role played some practice for that before the parents left. And one parent came back the following week and said, I did it and it didn't work. And so we drilled down into that situation. What did she mean by the fact that it didn't work? Well, she said, I had my kids in the playground, and when it was time to go, they started to kick off and not want to leave and, you know, do a bit of a tantrum and crying and no, I don't want to go. And she said, so I said to them, oh, you're having fun in the park and you don't want to leave, right? That's the empathy. We had practiced that on the course in that first week. And she said, and they still cried. And when we say empathy plus boundary, what we mean is it's time to leave. So you say, you're having fun in the park and you don't want to leave. I can see that. And then you pick them up and remove them to your car anyway. Yeah, so that's what I mean. So you take the action. You can lift a 3-year-old, and just because they're crying doesn't mean you shouldn't lift them into the car. So she had thought that the empathy meant that they would stop crying and be happy to leave the park immediately. That's not what it means. Sometimes, you can see with children who have low persistence, low intensity, you might see that a little bit of empathy just soothes them completely. And they're perfectly happy to trot along after you once they've had that empathy. I have a lot of clients and they have children like that, and it works a treat, but it doesn't work like that with every child. That is not a cause for worry, because underneath it all, you're demonstrating that's in fact a really excellent scenario, I would say, because you're demonstrating that you do understand your child and you're in charge. So when you say it's time to leave the park, it is time to leave the park. So the reason why the park situation, I'm going to use that kind of scenario now to explain some of the way that learning and our brains work. So we have positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. Now I've got a graph here. It might be, I can hold this up, right? So you can see, there we go. So on one line, we have increase and decrease in behavior. And on the other, we have adding and removing a stimulus. Yeah. So positive and negative reinforcement. People, I don't expect that people will understand this. This is quite technical, but I'm going to do a little bit of an explanation of what these things are about. So reinforcement increases the likelihood of a behavior and punishment decreases the likelihood of a behavior, right? So if it's reinforcing, you're going to get more of a behavior. If it's punishment, you're going to get less of behavior. Positive reinforcement applies a stimulus. So you give something. So that's the carrot, right? The carrot as opposed to the stick. Negative reinforcement increases the likelihood of the behavior by removing an aversive stimulus, right? So the great explanation or the great example for that to help you get your head around it is a headache. You take a paracetamol and the headache goes away. So taking paracetamol is negatively reinforced. Because the pain goes away, you're more likely to take a paracetamol the next time you have a headache, right? So that's reinforcement. You just remember reinforcement increases the likelihood of behavior. Punishment decreases the likelihood of behavior. So positive punishment, again, it's you add something, right? Same as positive reinforcement, you add a positive stimulus. So you give praise, you give a financial reward, you give an ice cream. That's the positive reinforcement. With positive punishment, you add an aversive stimulus, it's called, right? So you add something negative, right? Negative punishment, you decrease the likelihood of behavior by negative. It's like subtraction, right? Rather than negative. It's not a bad thing. So you can remove a good thing, and that's actually negative punishment. Yeah. So you were going to go to the ballpark and play games this afternoon, but because a child has behaved badly this morning, you remove the trip to the ballpark to play the game, and that's a negative punishment, right? So the removal of something positive is actually punishing. Extinction is up there as well to explain that reinforcement alone isn't enough to eliminate negative behavior necessarily, right? So you can see a reduction in poor behavior if you remove the things that are reinforcing it. Yeah, and that's called an extinction program. So I remember when I discovered that my children were squabbling, because, you know, siblings will squabble. And I was trying to help them stop squabbling. But one moment I had a little bit of an insight and I took my own advice and suddenly realized that I was pouring baby bio on the squabbling behavior. And so I would step in and try to negotiate and navigate and, inverted commas, help them. Yeah. And it suddenly dawned on me that they were getting too much attention for the poor behavior and I better remove it. So I removed the positive reinforcement of my attention and their squabbling behavior dropped off. So that's extinction. It's wonderful if extinction is all you need to do to get rid of bad behavior, but sometimes we need to do what, technically speaking, is punishment. A lot of parents prefer the word consequences, right? So let's explain how people learn. So any event that's accompanied by high emotion will lead to instantaneous learning. So depending on your age, for my parents, my mom can remember where she was when she heard about JFK dying. I can remember where I was when the Twin Towers fell. I remember where I was when Princess Diana died, right? So these are highly emotive events and they form flashbulb memories. They like instantaneously get coded into memory. But learning is always going on, right? So whether or not you're using reinforcement and punishment, these technical things, in a conscious way or not, there are contingencies in the environment which your child will be learning based on. So I was expecting a different slide next. Never mind, we can go here. So an awful lot of parents, when they shy away from using consequences in an effective manner, and they think that if you explain to a child why they ought to cooperate with you, then they will. And of course, we are creatures of reason. We are meaning-making machines, and we do reason very much all the time. But two rules of thumb that I have come up with is to do with the age of reason, which is approximately 7. I mean, it's a movable feast. Some children attain it earlier, some children later. Girls often get there a little bit earlier than boys. But I came up with my own important rule of thumb, which is don't reason before the age of reason, because I see parents get into this massive tangle, right? They're trying to teach, right? So they're hoping to teach. And so they explain why a child shouldn't do that. Don't do that, it upsets mommy. Don't do that, it upsets your sibling. You know, don't do that, it makes your sibling cry, or it makes mommy cry, or anything like this. And it's all well intentioned, but of course, before the age of around about 7, it's simply not going to work. I mean, let's face it, it often doesn't work even with adults. Like if it was that simple, we'd never have any disagreements, right? You know, I come to my spouse and I say, oh, you know, do you think you could please just not do that? And on we move. And, you know, they become capable of doing that. It's like, that's not quite how human beings work. So if we reason too much, we get into this kind of endless negotiation sort of situation, because we're teaching that everything can be negotiated. So I say, don't reason before the age of reason, and don't reason with the unreasonable. What do I mean by that? It's like, if a child has gone into full-blown tantruming, kicking on the floor, slamming doors, yelling, screaming, the back part of their brain is in charge, right? So this is the brain. It's sort of like this kind of shape. I'm trying to get it where you can see it, yeah? And in the tantrum, the prefrontal cortex has disconnected, like it's no longer in charge, right? The lower part of the brainstem is now in charge. And there is no point in reasoning with the unreasonable behavior, because the front part of the brain has flipped its lid, and language won't really work. So that's not the time for education. That's just the time for containment. Let's talk about consequences. So I want to talk about the golden rule, silver rule, and much lesser known bronze rule, right? So consequences are always happening, right? But very often parents step in to save children from the consequences of their behavior. So we tend to know the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then the silver rule is the inverse of that: don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. And I'm not quite sure where I got the bronze rule from, if I made it up myself or if I encountered it somewhere, but I came to understand that you oughtn't to do for others what they ought to do for themselves. And I called this the bronze rule. And I find that it's very tempting as a parent to not allow the consequences to happen for the child. So let me give you an example of this. If children won't get ready for school in a timely fashion, then they're going to be late. And it's very difficult to allow the lateness to occur, right? So I'm thinking of a time when my daughter was dilly-dallying with getting dressed. And when the time to leave the house came, I had to pick her up, not fully clothed, in some version of part pajamas, part clothing. And I picked up the rest of her clothes and I strapped her into the back of the car. She was not happy about this, I might add, and told her that she was going to have to go to school not fully dressed and finish getting dressed in the car. And that was incredibly awkward for her. So that's the bronze rule in action. Yeah, it's tempting as a parent to help your child on with their clothes, help them put on the tops and the bottoms, and gather the lunch boxes and gather the sports kit and gather the musical instruments and put them all into the car. But actually, if you're not happy about doing that and you want the child to do it for themselves, then you need to let the consequences happen. So that might mean, as it did for my daughter, arriving in the school car park, still getting dressed, or it might mean arriving at school without whatever musical instrument was needed that day. And I think parents want to avoid that because it's hard for us as well, right? We might have to go to school and say that, you know, child hasn't got their violin today because they didn't leave school in a timely fashion. So we seek to avoid those consequences because family is a system, yeah, and very often the consequence doesn't just fall to the child, it also falls to the parent, especially nowadays when, you know, the schools keep track of whether or not you're late or whether or not you're showing up. But I find that most schools understand this thing and they can be very understanding and be really on board when a parent goes in and tells them, look, we have a problem at home getting into school. I'm far too involved doing stuff for my children that I oughtn't to be doing. And I'm going to put it onto a program to extinguish this me doing it for them and get them to do it for themselves. And while we're getting this up and running, there might be some lateness for the first few days. And, you know, my experience tells me that schools are hugely receptive to parents doing this and really support them to get that up and running, because it, you know, the schools would prefer that the children are able to manage their own stuff as well and put on their own coats. So letting that kind of thing happen can be painful for a parent, and it can be hard to trust that that is the right thing to do. And I'm not saying don't ever rescue a child. You know, I have driven the forgotten PE kit to school for either of my children. But if you have a pattern that's developed, then what you need to do is step back and let the consequences happen for the child and not break the bronze rule of doing for them what they ought to do for themselves. Now, these next two concepts are pretty tricky as well. So how serious a consequence should you use to bring a child's behavior online or to get rid of a bad behavior? Yeah, the answer is the minimum force necessary to get rid of the behavior, right? So let's use an illustration. Say you have one sibling who's hitting the other sibling. How much, or like what should you use to get rid of that? I talk about ever increasing consequences, right? If you have a particularly cooperative child, the first time they hit their sibling, you go over and you say, oh, no, stop. That's not okay. We don't hit. Something like that, yeah? And if you have a particularly cooperative child, they may actually be able to follow that instruction. But an awful lot of children are not going to be able to follow that instruction. So you're going to need to move up to the next level, right? And that, if the child is particularly young, like if they're only 2 or 3 years of age and the sibling is only 1, or even if they're older, if you've got like 6 and 3, you still may be able to actually physically lift the child away from the offender, or lift the offender away from the victim, the one who's been hit, and add the no. So you physically remove it by moving. Maybe that'll be enough. Maybe that'll extinguish the behavior. Or you might need to move to the next level, right? You might have to move to choices and consequences, right? And now is where we're moving into that punishment idea, right? Remember, positive and negative punishment. You say, okay, you stop hitting your sister, or no TV after bed tonight, for example. Yeah, so you apply, you withdraw the privilege, right? So withdrawal of privilege is a type of punishment that lots of parents use. When we're talking about using withdrawing privileges, it's most ideal if the consequence is a sort of a natural or related consequence. So for instance, if my children were squabbling over what to watch on the iPlayer, I would step in and lift the iPlayer away from them and go, okay, you can't decide what you want to watch. So I'm just going to take this away for a moment and you can come to me if you've figured out how to share it properly. Something like that, yeah. Because if you do that, if you step in and take something away, right? So say somebody is bashing their bicycle into another child's game, yeah, then you don't need to do an awful lot of explaining. You can let the environment do the teaching. So you step in and remove the bicycle, put it in the shed, I always recommend, parents often ask how long for, and I hear parents saying, you've got this is taken away for a week or maybe a month if it's a second or serious offense. I think that overnight, that's what always worked best in my house, and that's what I recommend. I like the idea that tomorrow's a new day, we can try again tomorrow. And also children, time feels very different for children. So, the idea of not having your bicycle for the rest of the day, that's quite long if you're a child. So, and I like the idea of, you have a chance again tomorrow to amend your behavior. If you step in and do that kind of thing, what you're doing is establishing what I call a credible threat of force. And it's tough language, isn't it? Yeah, but a credible threat of force is what keeps the peace. Right. So if you do a few big consequences like that, then your children will know you mean business. And then you can use that sort of 1970s technique of giving them the look or using just a word, because they know you'll take action and you mean it. This is an example I'll just show you. So this was when my daughter was in the pestering stage, and pestering is something that drives an awful lot of parents mad. It used to drive me mad. So you have a child approach you and goes, oh, can I go somewhere? Can I have an ice cream? Can I do this? Can I make a cake right when you're in the middle of preparing dinner? And because of my daughter's temperament, I used to try and avoid direct no's a lot of the time, because that was often a red rag to a bull. So I would say something like, I'll think about it, or maybe later. And I've explained in advance that you're not supposed to pester. If she continues to pester, my answer changes from maybe to definitely no. And then if she pesters again, this is where you need a consequence. So when she was about 6 or 7 at this stage, I would have her sit down immediately and write a gratitude list of all the things that she got today or that week. So what I'm doing there is it's positive punishment. Yeah, I'm applying an aversive stimulus. Yeah, so a gratitude list you might think of as a nice thing, but she doesn't want to write a gratitude list. But that's the consequence if you pester mummy. Yeah, you have to write a gratitude list of all the things that mummy normally gives you, and it has the added benefit of reducing self-pity about not getting whatever it is that you're asking for this time. I've just mentioned my daughter's temperament. So my daughter is highly persistent. This is the work of Thomas and Chess around about 1970s. Children are all different. Human beings are all different. So, some children approach a new thing when they're first presented with it, and other children are like, no way am I going near a new activity, a new person, a new food. Some people are able to transition very easily, adaptability. So these are you can look this up. This is fantastic. It's Thomas and Chess. Mary Sheedy Kirkinka in The Spirited Child outlines all of this very nicely. But it's a really good idea to get an understanding of your temperament and your child's temperament. And some children are highly sensitive, highly intense, so they have a big reaction to things. And I love, if anybody is Al-Anon, one of the key things that Al-Anon will teach anybody who goes for a while is the 3 C's. You didn't cause it, you can't cure it, you can't control it. Temperament is innate. It's shown itself to be quite persistent over time. It doesn't easily change. And we know this. This is in we know this. We know that there are Tiggers and we know that there are Eeyores. Yeah, there are people who are gloomy. That's mood, the one in the top middle. People who are gloomy and people who are happy generally. Glass half empty, glass half full. So it's really important to gauge the temperament of your child in figuring out how to deal with them really well as well. The role of authority. I mean, one thing that's a danger with people like me, so-called parenting experts getting involved in this, is that we can end up undermining parents' confidence. And one of the things I really try to hand back to parents is confidence to be in charge of their family. Human beings are hierarchical creatures. If you're not in charge in your family, then your children will be. And a child who can sense that their parents are not in charge is generally a child that doesn't feel fully secure, doesn't feel fully safe, doesn't have confidence that the parents will be able to take care of them and do what needs to be done. And then that's a child that's often quite unhappy. So be in charge in your family. It's okay to use discipline tools to get good behavior from your children and to teach them self-control, because a child who's not in control, and in the beginning we can't regulate ourselves, but little by little through our parents' intervention we become people who can regulate ourselves and be people of self-discipline, and that's where peace and happiness lies. Little word about the difference between love and respect. So I've got a book here. This would be the attachment parenting approach: respectful parents, respectful kids. Now, I'm all for treating children in a way that doesn't undermine their dignity. But in fact, I've come to believe that it's not really a two-way street when it comes to respect. I believe that parents are in natural authority over their children, and therefore we must love our children. And because our children require us to be in authority over them, they must respect our authority. So in fact, I would say that parents must love their children and children must respect their parents. It's a slightly different emphasis. Of course, children also love their parents, and parents also respect their children's dignity, but it's a slightly different emphasis. And a quick word as well about the difference between nice and kind. Somebody said this to me once, and I thought it was really helpful. I'm perfectly capable of being nice to my children when I don't want to be, when in fact I'm a little bit cross that they've asked again when I told them not to bother me, and I'm afraid of triggering a power struggle and I don't have time for it. So I'm nice and I give in to whatever it was that they've asked me for, when in fact kindness would require me connecting with the fact that I love my children, which I define as willing their good, and telling them the truth. And that's kind. And it's much harder to do sometimes than it is to be nice. Nice comes more quickly. We're often conditioned in being nice and not so much in being kind. But this has been a really important thing, I think, for me in dealing with my own children. The role of consistency. So discipline works best if it's firm, fair, kind, and consistent. So it's very tricky if children can't figure out what's going to happen when they behave in certain ways, then you tend to get more turmoil. If it's predictable, mom and dad will do what they say they'll do, and then it's easier for children to learn how to modify their own behavior and regulate themselves. That said, we don't have to be 100% perfectly consistent. Children can understand that the rules can be a bit different between mom's house and dad's house if there are two different homes. Children can understand that the rules can be different when we're on holidays or visiting with grandparents or when people are visiting us, and that's often why we see behavior change when you have visitors. Children might kick off a little bit because they know they'll get away with it. So it's important to be consistent, but we don't need to tie ourselves into pretzels and deal with something, when someone is visiting. We can always deal with it later. You remember I said children have memory. So if I'm ever stuck for a consequence that I'm happy with, I can say to them, that is not acceptable. I'm going to come up with a consequence for that, and I'll get back to you later on that. So that was one of the things that I did consistently. It was like, if I can't think of what to do in the moment, I can tell them I'm going to deal with it and come back to it. And as long as I do come back to it, then that's good, because they will remember. Wants versus needs is really important to talk about as well. I found that an awful lot of problems in the family of difficult behavior stem because a child is locked into what they want. It's not a parent's job to give a child what they want. Your job as a parent is to give them what they need. So for instance, to take a trivial but mundane example. My daughter would have very happily eaten sausages, coleslaw, and rice every day for dinner when she was a little girl. But I'm not satisfied that that's a nutritious diet. And I know she needs a nutritious diet, even though she'd quite happily, in fact, she'd probably just go sausages, ice cream. That would be her ideal diet, and that's what she wants, but it's not what she needs. So you need to rise above what can sometimes be, intense behavior oriented to getting us what we want, and focus coming back to the needs. Have you ever been in a row with somebody, somebody that you're in a relationship with, and even though there's no resolution of the two different things that you want, I want to go on holiday for a week to somewhere hot, but you want to go for 2 weeks and to somewhere cool, but if we can listen to each other and understand that, that's meeting that need to be seen and heard. And even though we don't resolve it, we can often reduce the temperature in the room by getting to the need rather than the want. And so there's always this need to be heard, to feel connected. Quick little word about strategies and goals. It was a key moment. My husband and I were both in recovery, and we'd done steps in our primary substance fellowship, and then we had done steps each in CODA recovery. But it was only when we did Recovering Couples Anonymous, RCA steps together, and after step 9 there, where we had deepened our amends to each other, that I really deeply understood the difference between strategies and goals in parenting. So as parents, our goal is to have happy, healthy, functional, contributing members of the human race. That's our goal for our children. We love our children. We will their good. We want to see them do well in life, to succeed in having happy relationships, to be comfortable in their own skins, to be able to stand in their own body and ask for what they want and need and take responsibility for going to get that. We both have that same goal. Our strategies often differed. And I say that moms and dads approach parenting in very different ways. And I think it's really important that moms learn to trust dads and dads learn to trust moms, because we each have these different approaches, and to communicate about on the level, remember to communicate on the level of goals sometimes, because you can get bogged down in strategies, and zooming back out and thinking about the goal can sometimes unclog a situation. It's the same with children. The child can get very locked into the strategy, but if you can help them think in terms of goals, it can sometimes break the stalemate. I think I've already mentioned that parenting is action, and that can be really hard. When you're tired, or when you're working from home maybe, or you're preparing a meal, or you're on the telephone to somebody else, it can be really hard to step in. You're having a nice, you're at the playground and you're having a nice conversation with some other moms, and this is going on. And it's hard to walk over, step in, take the spade away, and find out what's going on. This would be a situation, right, where, is this an older sibling? I always say, be a bit of a detective. Is this an older sibling being mean in a pattern of cruelty to a younger sibling? Or is this a younger sibling who can really, twist the screws on an older sibling? And because they're the younger sibling, they know that mom will come down in favor of them. So sometimes the best thing to do is to just take the spade and step back and let them solve it for themselves. Sometimes no words is the best thing to say. A little word referencing my talk on surrender in a way. So this was pivotal for me, especially in those sort of 3 years, 3 to 6, 7 of recovery. If it's hysterical, it's historical. I remember one time my children were playing with each other and having a great time. They were really excited and happy and having a lovely time. And I felt so much distress inside me. I wanted to stop them from playing. And I remember sitting down on a chair, sitting on my hands and biting my tongue to stop me from interfering in their joy and fun. I knew my reaction was much too big for what was going on in the moment. And that's the moment to ring a sponsor or journal or call a friend in recovery and uncover it. We don't have to. I think it's really important to learn that sometimes if my reaction is too big, it's not about what's going on in the present, and we don't have to deal with everything in the present. Sometimes self-care means taking myself away and dealing with that so I don't act it out on my children. The final thing I want to leave you with, and I've used up my whole hour, just unable to bring this in at 45 minutes. I've come to believe that love is the perfect mixture of mercy and justice. Yeah. And to reference again that difference between moms and dads. Moms are brilliant at mercy. Dads find it easier to do justice. But love is the perfect blend of the two. And that's why parenting is not a science, it's an art form. Sometimes you need to lean more heavily into one or other of these things, and getting the balance between the two is what leads to the most successful outcomes, I think. So that's my takeaway message today. If you've been more in the behaviorist camp, then how about adding in a little bit of attachment? If you've been fully in the attachment camp, then actually it's time to maybe add in some of those rules of learning and get a little bit more comfortable with using consequences and, you know, the old-fashioned word punishment. That you can't eliminate bad behavior with carrots. Sometimes you need to use that stick, and that's the justice component of love. And I firmly believe nowadays that, you know, discipline or justice is very much a part of love. There's my website if anybody would like to get involved or contact me or ask questions. I know we're going to have a Q&A now, but there's the details again. Thank you for listening.
Samantha, was just wonderful. Thank you so much for everything you said. Every single word was perfect.